All right, it looks like we're live, and I'll open up the meeting unless actually Representative Co-Chair Harnett, would you like to open up this meeting?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you,
Thank
Senator
you.
Carney. Welcome to the members of the Judiciary Committee that were able to make it today as we hear again from the Deadly Force Review Panel. You may recall that they issued a report in January of this year with the cases that they had reviewed, which has been supplemented by a review of a case that we just received over the weekend regarding a use of deadly force in Thorndike in 2019. The purpose of today's meeting is to hear from both Francine Stark as chair and Vendine Vafiatis as co-chair about the really what I thought thorough recommendations they laid out in the January 2022 report, and then for committee members to have the opportunity to raise any questions they might have about any of the information that we've received from the panel. It is a small group, but I will just have us introduce ourselves briefly, and I will start with my co-chair, Senator Carney.
Thank you so much. I'm Ann Carney. I am very happy to be with all of you today for this important discussion. I represent Senate District 29, which is South Portland, Cape Elizabeth, and a little bit of Scarborough.
Thank you. And Representative Moriarty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning all. I'm Steve Moriarty from Cumberland, and I represent my hometown and the southern part of Gray.
Thank you, Representative Moriarty. Representative Reckitt.
Morning, thank you. My name is Lois Reckitt, and I represent the ocean end of South Portland, which is currently District 31, about to have a transformation into District 122. But at the moment, it's District 31.
Thank you, Representative Reckitt. And my name is Tom Harnett. I serve as the House Chair of Judiciary. I represent House District 83, which is the town of Farmingdale and the city of Gardner. And Vice Chair Vafiatis.
Good morning. My name is Vendine Vafiatis, and I'm a citizen representative on the panel and have been on it since the beginning.
Thank you. And Chair Stark.
I'm Francine Stark. I'm the chair of the Deadly Force panel and another citizen member of the panel, but I do also am the executive director of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence and serve in several other capacities in chairing and serving on state commissions and committees.
Thank you very much. And Francine, I don't know if it's just me, I'm having a difficult time hearing you.
I'll close my window.
Get closer to your microphone. And we are joined today, and this is bittersweet for me, we are joined by our analyst, Peggy Reinsch, who, as many of you know, will be ending a storied career with the Office of Policy and Legal Analysis at the end of next month, since it's the last day of May. And while we will have the opportunity to thank her for her service, I want to thank her publicly right now. She has been just such an asset to the legislature and personally to me in this committee. So Peggy Reinsch, and who I hope will be her successor. We're also joined by Janet Sacco, who has worked with the committee primarily on tribal matters, but not exclusively. She did a lot of work on probate as well, and will be just a remarkable addition to the Judiciary Committee moving forward. I really feel like I should be introducing Supi Panett, except that because the session is over, she's not here, because I could talk to her about the Rangers moving on to the Eastern Finals in the NHL last night, but I'll save that for another time. So with that, Chair Stark, I don't know how you want to proceed on your end, but Vice Chair Vafiatis mentioned that you folks wanted to outline some things you were concerned about and recommendations you had, and then we will open it up for conversation with the members of the committee who are here today. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'm gonna turn it over to Vendine to start our conversation, I think.
Yes, so good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for making this time available to chat with us. We gave you, in January, we had maybe it's the beginning of February, we had a formal presentation and a good conversation with the majority of the members of the committee, and we appreciate that opportunity very much. And we talked about the specific recommendations in our annual report, which we're required to provide you, and we were happy to provide you with specific recommendations, some background information, some profiles of the individuals that were involved in these law enforcement shootings. We analyzed 10 cases, specific cases at that time. We've seen 4 more cases. We've reviewed 4 more cases this year. Fully reviewed them with the panel, and the trends continue. So part of why we were hoping to have this conversation and are pleased to have it is to talk a little bit more about the panel and the work, and talk with you. We're not going to go over all the specific recommendations again, you'll be happy to know, but we'll just to talk with you a little bit more about the panel, its makeup, and what we're trying to achieve and what we've sort of learned as it's evolved, and highlight a couple of areas. We're very interested in having this conversation because this panel was created and it has some very specific statutory authorizations, and it's an ongoing panel. It's not a quick come in, after a year, look at this problem and write a report. This is more of seen as more of an ongoing panel with specific powers and duties and responsibilities for reporting to this committee. So we were very interested in the expectations, if any, of this committee. And if this committee needs more information, the judiciary community needs more information of what the panel's been finding and thinking about, we certainly want to keep the conversation open for that. One of our responsibilities is to recommend changes of improving standards, statutes, rules, training policies, and those kinds of things in our powers and duties to increase public safety and officer safety. Well, every case that we get to review after the Attorney General's office has made their use of force determination, we look at the case in a broader context. We are not striving to re-examine what the Attorney General determined. That is not our responsibility or our legislative mandate. We look at to the extent we have the information, we look at the broader circumstances in the community, in law enforcement, and particularly in the individual that was the recipient of lethal force. Sometimes they don't survive, and sometimes the individuals do. But the Attorney General, as you know, reviews all those cases. So we're looking at the case in a broader context. And of course, as you know, from the information you either receive publicly or from our reports, most of the individuals are males. They're in their, mid-40s to, a few of them are, about 5 of them last year were, no, not 5. There were a couple that were under 30. They often have mental health issues. They've had prior involvement with law enforcement. They often have substance abuse, and have on 50% of them have been involved in domestic violence incidences. So the profile of these individuals, where not always the same, majority have those components, and they often are in rural areas and known to the communities. They're often individuals or families that are isolated. They're known to state police, they're known to local law enforcement, they're known to community members, they're known to their neighbors often of having heard domestic issues or had people doing target practice in their backyard, or some kinds of disturbances in the community. But these often are rural, isolated individuals. And then we're asking often rural law enforcement to respond to these circumstances. And as usual, we're asking law enforcement to intervene in these circumstances when they may or may not have the experience, skill, time, or resources to do a good job on their own. So with that as a backdrop, we do review these cases. after the case is complete, two things happen. One, the local law enforcement, primary local law enforcement agency does an internal review of what happened. And since you've given this committee confidential powers to review the circumstances, we get that information because those are personnel matters, and those are confidential reports that the law enforcement agency issues, mostly for the internal use of their own folks. You know, the law enforcement officers that were involved, they review their background, their training, their most recent, whether they have their most recent training completed, including use of deadly weapons. And they also review their own policies and procedures of their agency. They would look at their equipment and they look at their circumstances, and they issue their own internal report. One thing I will note is that since we've been looking at them, they've become more comprehensive. Not saying that I wouldn't say that they were overly analytical about their issues to try to be respectful of the agencies, but they do give a more comprehensive look. They do use community members and law enforcement individuals from other agencies on their panel, and we have an opportunity to review them. And then we do our own review, and we submit our own, as you've seen in the most recent report for Thorndike, we submit our own recommendations, our own observations and recommendations. We send those reports to the law enforcement agencies involved, so they get our reports in addition to you getting them. And one of the things that we're interested in talking with you about is, what do we do with the recommendations? There's no statutory responsibility for us to follow up, nor are we seeking any kind of, at least at this point, any kind of sort of mandatory responsibility, because we wouldn't, if they didn't, I'm not sure we'd have much power to enforce it. I'm a lawyer, and so I don't like and I know the Judiciary Committee doesn't like to pass legislation that sounds that sounds accountable when there's no one that can require the accountability, right? But we are interested in your thoughts about the recommendations and observations we send you, the law enforcement agencies, and their own internal reports. We have some thoughts about what we might do with that information, but I think I'll pause here to see if you have any thoughts on that. And I know I didn't give you any warning, so if you want us to just keep on going and you want to think about it, that's fine. I just want to pause. Representative Moriarty, I guess, Ann, I'm sorry, Senator, should I call on him? I apologize. No, go ahead. I'm sorry, Senator. It was informal. I apologize. I just saw his hand.
Sure, I was muted there. I apologize.
Okay.
I will open it up. First of all, thank you very much for that report. And Representative Moriarty, you had a hand up, and that we will just use our regular hands. It's a pretty small group, so
Okay.
Representative Moriarty, go ahead.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Vendine, I have a couple of questions to make sure I understand the scenario of a typical case. It begins with, obviously, an incident, and we don't have to go any further than that, but the incident may involve multiple law enforcement agencies, to include city or town, law enforcement officials, county deputies, and possibly the state police as well. So following the incident, does every department, law enforcement agency or department do its own investigation of that incident?
No, the agency or more than one agency that involves the law enforcement officer that does the actual shooting or use of discharging a lethal weapon, that is the only agency that does it. Now, there might be more than one officer that shoots, right? So there could be a state police and a local law enforcement officer that both shoot their service weapons. One of the recommendations that we made in our report, in our annual report, was that when these law enforcement agencies do their review, that any law enforcement agency that was at the scene, that it be involved in the review. So that's a really good point, Representative Moriarty, that you've observed there.
Thank you. And then following the investigation done by the so-called shooting agency, is that when the Attorney General's investigation begins?
No, the Attorney General's investigation begins immediately.
Ah.
As Representative Harnett knows, they get the call in the middle of the night, and often the Attorney General's office is dispatched immediately to be involved with the circumstances at the scene. Often a detective or depending on the circumstances, they get involved immediately.
And then finally, just to round out the scenario, your panel does not get involved until the AG's office has completed its investigation, as I understand it.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Moriarty. Are there additional questions from committee members? I have a couple, Vice Chair Vafiatis. I think you raised the biggest question is, so what do we do? What do we do with all these recommendations? Because in the report that you issued in January, you set out recommendations. You gave a pretty specific overview of the type of persons that are creating these cases, these situations, racial, age, substance abuse, criminal history. And then you said you lay out things that might be lacking, and those are experience, skill, time, and resources for the responding agencies. Some of those, that skill development, time, experience, and training requires money, but it requires resources. But there's nothing in the statute that establishes the panel that really tells us what to do with that. It doesn't say you come to the judiciary and say you need X hundred thousands of dollars to do thus and so. So I guess my question is, what in a perfect world, what do you see being done with these recommendations? Is it for the Judiciary Committee or members thereof or individual members of the legislature to develop proposed statutes or regulations to address the issues raised in the recommendations? I hope I'm being not totally vague here or obtuse.
Francine, did you want me to keep going, or did you want to jump in here?
Sure. I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question from where we sit, because of course we don't have any paid staff. I mean, the committee is basically a volunteer panel with support from the AG's office, that is in terms of the Attorney General's ability to sort of support Brian McMaster to give his able assistance to us. But I think, the question about what more the panel can actually action of its recommendations really is a central question. Where I sit, the things that we report about in our findings, especially our annual report, have implications for a number of committees of the legislature, and is pertinent to a number of legislative initiatives that come forward regarding a number of issues around public health and how we make sure that we have the kind of community supports in place for people who are living chronic circumstances. And while I sit thinking about, one of the other things I do these days is sit on the board of trustees of the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, which really is a focal point for a lot of the recommendations. Like, for example, one of the things that we want to do is make sure that there's some improvement in how these internal reviews are done. And it would make tons of sense for the Maine Criminal Justice Academy to come up with a standardization and do some training and follow up on that. But the Maine Criminal Justice Academy really has a really tiny staff of people, and they don't have authority over any of the law enforcement departments. They have the authority over certifying particular officers, but they can't sort of mandate that all law enforcement have to do a thing. They can provide model policies and model standards and train to them and all of that. So when I think about this question of what is actionable, part of it is making sure that these reports are brought to bear when conversations are happening related to many of these important resource questions, but also structural questions around what is Maine's optimal infrastructure for law enforcement, and how does it interact with our system of mental health crisis intervention, which I know that lots of people are trying to put their best brains to as we speak. So, that's sort of a long-winded way of bringing that around, but I feel like that's part of why we came to you all, because I think the question of how do we take any of the pieces that might make a final legislative initiative or turn into a bill, like we had regarding sort of family members or third parties providing firearms to people in a known crisis, for example. We can throw that out there, but there's really nobody on our panel with the resource or appropriate sort of role to then sort of move that into the shape of legislation moving forward.
And if I could follow up, what my concern is, and it's always the concern when reports are issued, even if it's an ongoing committee, is that they go to a shelf and they sit there and we all shake our heads and go, yes, we know what the problem is, but we don't take the steps to address it. And what I'm hearing from you, I think, is that it's not, your panel doesn't have staff. Do we need, and I know people don't like to grow government, but do we need a person or department or part of a department to lead the effort on this particular issue and to have the ability to do that work with the various committees that have jurisdiction over these issues in the legislature, to come up with concrete proposals to implement the recommendations and secure funding when necessary? Senator Carney?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on what you said, Representative Harnett, because I actually went back yesterday and listened to our February 2nd meeting. And there are so many recommendations that you made, and some of them are very big and some of them are kind of more manageable. And what struck me as I was listening through, particularly with your regard to your recommendations about empowering and funding, giving the Maine Criminal Justice Academy resources to, develop standard protocols and that sort of thing, is that I feel like we need sort of a convener. We need somebody to hear from, for example, this person in Thorndike who was injured in the incident that we received the most recent report on, the family members, the law enforcement officers involved, the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, to get more information about what the right changes are to be made. And it's hard to do that in the heat of the legislative session when as a committee, we're pulled into a lot of different directions, and our time is to do a deep dive into anything is really limited. But I would love to hear what your thinking would be the most impactful next steps that we could take?
Well, one of the things we've had sort of two responses to that. We've struggled, and Francine and I have talked a lot about this, we've struggled about how to have credibility with all the various constituencies, with of course, primarily the Judiciary Committee and the legislature to whom we report, but also the law enforcement community. We, in this state, as in most states, we have law enforcement agencies have problems recruiting officers. We assume kind of like that public safety is there, it exists and it's adequately supported and there's adequate law enforcement available. But we're trying to find the balance between the support of the community, the family, and public safety and officer safety. That's specific in our responsibilities. It says that we're trying to find recommendations that are that demonstrate increased public safety and officer safety. We read nationally what happens, like in the most recent horrendous Verde situation, and that's very complicated about what happened there. The results aren't complicated, and I've have a hard time raising my spirits up lately, just in the wake of that. And obviously, the officers are going to have a significant review in that circumstance of what they did and didn't do. And in Maine, often our situations are in rural areas, isolated, and the individual is isolated. And often, if it's a real serious situation, the state police SWAT, team gets involved, and they create a perimeter, and all these things you hear about, they do, and they do a very good job. But their safety is at risk, and neighbors are, individual neighbors are at risk of public safety. So, trying to create, I believe that one of the reasons this panel exists is to try to do some of what you just said, Senator Carney, and how you create a forum to talk about these issues in a rational way, involving someone that was shot and survived, in your example of the Thorndike case, and the family, and the community, and the law enforcement. I think about, in all candor, and I'm saying this publicly, that it will be an interesting and tricky way for the committee to establish a forum that they feel that will be constructive. Not saying that all the voices shouldn't be heard in some way, but I do think that that's difficult. One of the things that could be strengthened would be the membership of the current panel. We really could use more public health, community public health representation on the panel. We could, we have this, as citizens, as non-law enforcement, the non-law enforcement representatives on the panel, which are in the minority. The majority of the panel are law enforcement and lawyers. And citizens, we ask questions, and we, often very difficult questions in these meetings, in the panel, and we get law enforcement's response, which is, they're very thoughtful and very reasonable. But there are voices missing, which is what you're addressing, Senator Carney. And I think public mental health, rural and community mental health services. The panel, the very beginning of our panel said that we were to include members that reflect diversity in Maine's racial, gender, indigenous, and tribal demographics. We do not. We do not. It's basically a white panel, male. There's three going to be, one person's leaving, another person's leaving, might end up with only two women on it. We do not have good representation. Perhaps a member of a family member, including a panel member that's been a family member of an incident that happened a number of years ago or something, when there's some perspective. I think that would be a really good place to start, would be to make sure that there was good representation on the panel, because the panel gets all the information. We read every case, we read hundreds of pages, we watch videos, we listen to 911 calls. We see the forensic reports, the medical examiner reports. We watch, we see photographs. It's a very, very comprehensive picture. And frankly, it's a lot of work to serve on the panel. And it would be great if there were more voices that could see that. Because the one thing that allows you to do is often, if we get a relatively full picture, is we can see it from all angles, from the community angles, from in this case, from the ex-wife's perspective of why, she got involved with Mr. Thorndike, and that's Mr. Thorndike, I can't remember his name, in the Thorndike incident. And you get the law enforcement when they first heard about it, when they started the scene, and what did they have from information when they arrived. And you can see how it unfolds, and it would be great if there was more representation at the table to get those full pictures, to be able to ask questions and make good recommendations. And I think that might be a place you want to start. The other thing, of course, is when we do have our annual report, I think it would be useful if the committee wanted to have, you had a public session, but perhaps maybe invite, nobody turns down an invitation from the Judiciary Committee. So if the Judiciary Committee wanted to have a conversation about the next annual report and wanted to invite certain constituencies to come in and ask to talk, I think that might be also another great way for you to get broader information about what's going on. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
One thing I would add to that is for me, an ongoing source of frustration is the focus on the incident itself. And I think, and we learn a lot from the focus on the incident itself, but what we have learned over all the review panels, including this one that have convened, is that the opportunity to have avoided the use of deadly force lies far ahead of the incident itself. And as long as we keep looking at the incident itself for solutions, we will not find them. The way this community, the way we as a state address the fact that we have people living in our communities who are at least intermittently a danger to themselves or others, but frequently not presenting in the very precise way you have to present in order to be involuntarily held, to be, is really, it's a trouble. I mean, the cases that we have looked at, and I just sit here and I just feel so sad to think about how this person's life, who has been taking care of them, and how ill-equipped those people are to actually, they basically are living in this containment posture. Parents with adult children who are struggling and have weapons in the home and calling for help rarely gets them help. And so for me, to spend much more energy than is already spent on investigating what happened in what is sometimes as few as a few seconds, and not have that capacity. And I'm frustrated with it every time the panel reviews a case. We just raise it up to say, we don't know the substance of the last 10 years or what exactly these people have been doing to try to create a web of care and safety precautions around this person. But somebody should care about that. Our job is to look at whether or not what could have happened in this particular incident that could have been different. But boy, does it ever have huge implications for this other story that we don't have the capacity or authority to really go back and do a lot of investigation around.
Yeah, when I look at, when I read the report about the Thorndike situation, you could see that the ex-wife and local law enforcement officers, everybody had been managing this individual's health condition, mental health condition, and they thought that they could keep managing it. And it's really tragic. So many people kind of involved and wanting to avert a crisis. And yeah, and you wonder how many times they got sort of close to the crisis situation that this report is about. And, you know, how were they able to avert that, and what could have been done to avert this one? It's really, it's so sad.
And for us to go forward, I think, and be effective for the panel, you know, it's been in existence 3 years. You know, it's sort of looking like, well, what are the next 3 years? You know, kind of what have we learned and what can we do going forward? To try, when I was trying to figure that out, what Francine and I were talking about, I was like, well, what was the expectation when the panel was created? Because I know that there is, I feel as a citizen member that that I can pretty much ask any question I want and advocate for any recommendation I want. So it's not that. It's just, is this panel meeting the expectations of what it was created for? And if it's not, what can we do better? You know, Francine, you know, we getting some support would be helpful. We come up with questions about, you know, particular law enforcement practices that we don't know. I'm a citizen, I don't really know what we should do, and I don't know what's going on nationally, and we have limited ability to find that information out. I think the more specific recommendations we can come up with allows us to have a more concrete conversation with law enforcement in the community and the mental health community and others that are involved, the emergency medical folks that are involved, when we can talk about concrete things. I think they're more, you know, it's more receptive. They're more receptive to that. To say to them, well, why aren't you about this? We have this, you know, in circumstances. One of the this next case we have is involved with a mental one we just reviewed. Is that you don't have that report yet? Was involved with a mental health situation, and an adult living with his parents in mental health, and he ended up within 74 seconds from when the law enforcement arrived and their involvement with him, he was dead. So and one of the law enforcement involved in that was a 24-year-old new law enforcement officer who'd been on the job for 6 months. Now we're asking him to go in and be a mental health counselor, and he does, you know, to deal with a mental health issue that was, somebody was saying there's a crazy guy around, you know, in town at the intersection with a knife, right? How does this 24-year-old law enforcement officer come in with the skill set to be able to deal with that outcome? You know, we're asking him to be sort of arrive on the scene and protect public safety. Most people were like, we just want law enforcement to come and protect us from this guy, that he doesn't hurt somebody. I mean, that's the expectation, right? Well, this individual's in a mental health crisis. And how do we ask this 24-year-old guy to come in and fix that? And when this individual went after him with a knife, he shot him, right? I mean, what was his alternative? I mean, they tried a taser first and it had no impact. You're surprised. It's amazing when you hear all that happens in 74 seconds. But, you know, they tried a taser, they tried briefly tried alternatives, but when they were threatened with a knife, that was the response. And this gentleman is dead. And so the conversation that gives the backdrop to the conversation that Francine's saying, what since the panel is an ongoing group, it needs broader voices on it, and it would be so helpful to have a conversation over time with the Judiciary Committee about your expectations of us, because, you know, we're just, you know, these cases are serious. They're impacting families and communities and law enforcement officers, and we want to evolve. The panel wants to evolve and do a really good job to be helpful to all those communities and to this committee.
Did you have any follow-up, Senator Carney, at this point?
I just have a very quick follow-up on the last point you made about the composition of the committee. Do you feel that the additional voices need to be added to the existing composition, or should And does the review panel get too big versus, are we changing up the existing number of seats, or are we going to add seats to the panel? I would just love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I think we probably need to not add lots of seats. We may need to add a couple of seats. In particular, I think the absence of naming community mental health within those ranks is a gap. I think that the other questions of broadening the composition demographically can be done, but it also reflects the change. We need also to change the demographics of what feeds to the panel, which has its own limitations. We're about to have more women in law enforcement than ever in the state of Maine at this point, according to this year's report from the MCJA. And so that is helpful, because I think that in any panel, what you're trying to do is, diversify who embodies each of those seats. So to the degree that we can improve upon that would be really helpful, and probably only add a couple of seats.
I also think that we could have fewer law enforcement representation. I mean, not that there's anything, a problem with the ones that are there, like the 6 law enforcement officers, there's one representative from the medical examiner's office, and there's 3 attorneys. Then there's 1 mental health person, 1 civil rights advocate, and 3 citizens. So the composition could change with, there's 15 members. I don't think going over 18 or 20 would make, I just don't think that would be productive. But I do think the current composition, and of course, there's no BIPOC representation or, other ethnic, it's a white panel. And so there's definitely demographic groups in Maine that aren't represented, and that should be improved. I just think it'll broaden the voices, it'll broaden the experience, people's experience and their personal and professional experience, because it is, I don't like to say this, but it is kind of a safe place to ask really hard questions of each other and of law enforcement, because we do have the benefit of reviewing a confidential record and having a confidential conversation about it. So broadening the voices and the experience, it's a really great place to do that. And I make, and it's also safe for me to make stupid questions. I don't understand how this happens. How do you in law enforcement, how does this work? Is this, what's an alternative to this? And not have to know, carefully craft my comment because I don't want to, offend anyone or try to get it right. And so it's a place for candor conversation, and it needs better representation. It's not going to solve anything, but it'll be a beginning, really, I think, improve the dialogue and the information that we can bring to you.
Representative Reckitt, and then Representative Moriarty.
I have a couple questions. Have any of the cases that you've seen at least involve Native folks, either as a shooter or a shootee? Nothing? Okay. The other is, I said to myself, when you talked about the young officer that was there, 24 years old, 6 months on the job, I'm wondering whether someone who is very near to that, a young officer, a new officer, might be an interesting perspective, at least to call upon occasionally, if not have on the panel, to say, what in the hell, I didn't know, how do you do, it's just like, how do we know what these young officers don't know if we don't ask them? And the problem is, of course, that there are people up in the chain of the law enforcement world are going to hear whatever it is they ask or say. So that's a problem. The other question I had is whether or not any of these folks on the panel are essentially from rural sections of the state. I don't know, most of the officers I don't know, I mean, other than the ones that are with the sheriff or that I've had interaction with on the criminal justice committee. And I'm curious as to why there's so many lawyers, and whether or not they've got another hat that I'm not aware of that would make them uniquely qualified to be also on this. So that's a panoply of questions, frankly, all sort of connected to that same who's at the table.
Well, we have, of course, Southern Maine, but we have a couple of folks from the Bangor area, from Central Maine. Francine's a rural representative.
Always the point of rural Maine.
Yeah, rather rural representative. The reason we have 3 lawyers is because that's prescribed on the committee, on the makeup of the committee. Representative Record, attorney representing plaintiffs, an attorney that's involved in criminal matters, so we end up with attorneys. And then they put me on it as a citizen, but unfortunately I'm also attorney. So we end up with that. And but there isn't a demographic requirement, definite demographic requirements for the committee membership. But it's more demographically diverse than some. And it's surprising that a lot of these, the one thing we talk about often is, what about the circumstance where law enforcement has to deal with these, and they don't use deadly force. In other words, an absolutely parallel circumstance where they are able to manage it and deadly force is not used. We don't hear about those. And they happen every day when law enforcement is successful. And often I do believe, and I'm not, this is not analytical, it's a personal opinion. I do believe that a lot of the reasons that we have so many rural cases is because often law enforcement to get there kind of at the last minute when things are really escalating, and they don't have a lot of opportunity, even if they're, have, more than 1 or 2 people showing up, that they don't have an opportunity to do more meaningful intervention that you might in a more urban area if you've got law enforcement involved in earlier. Because a lot of law enforcement in rural areas are extremely skilled in dealing with this. I mean, they are the mental health workers. They do stop by these isolated individuals in homes out there and ask them how they're doing and do wellness checks and deal with the emotional babbling at the front door, but at least somebody stopped and checked in to see if they were okay. So I mean, there's a lot of really good things going on, but it's a lot to ask. Law enforcement agency, and I believe Francine at the Criminal Justice Academy, they're instituting more mental health training starting this next year. Is that right?
They chose mental health as the required continuing education for this year for law enforcement. So their required 6 hours is going to be focused on mental health. I mean, I also want to say that the 24-year-old responding officer was also noted for his really quick thinking and excellent conduct in this particular incident. Because his choices were slim and he made good ones. So it was really the thing that is, I want to bring up 2 things. One is related to mental health and the other is about law enforcement infrastructure. The issue around the question of the management of people suffering from various kinds of mental health challenges in our communities is bigger than all of us in terms of responding to it. But what we certainly see time and again is that the law enforcement response is always going to be that. And it's going to be asking people in a not rational state to respond to rational commands. They won't. So the things, so no matter how nicely you say, drop your weapon, or they're not going to. And it's very so that in the cases that we have looked at, one of the really huge other problems that we see time and time again is the fragmented nature of communication of criminal histories across even just outside of given municipalities who have their own record keeping system, the fact that we have dealt with a couple of different cases, and this one in Thorndike was one where information about this person's history, their history with interactions with law enforcement, would not have been immediately available to those responding officers because the databases between Kennebec County and the responding state troopers would not immediately have rendered information to them. We had a case that in Jefferson that you have the report on to look at closely. We've got a person who has tons of information that would have been really helpful to those officers to have on site, including the fact that this was a person prohibited from having weapons who in the end has 32. And so we have still in 2022, law enforcement agencies blind to what other agencies have for immediate, pertinent, important information about the safety of our communities, can't talk to each other's databases. That is absolutely ludicrous. And there have been conversations about this over time. There have been panels and paneled. It's a sticky problem that needs to be solved. I don't know what the right answer is. Nobody on our panel knows the right answer, only that there's a lot of those in place. Some smart tech firm has got to figure out how to make these disparate systems be able to talk to each other in real time, or figure out something else, because it's really costing our law enforcement officers themselves are in greater danger because they don't have information they need. And citizens are in greater danger because law enforcement doesn't have information that they need in real time. So it serves no one well, and is a big problem that needs to be solved.
The other thing is that, you know, a number of law enforcement agencies are hiring mental health professionals, like in consortiums or in their own, as part of their own department, to assist in these circumstances. And we don't see a lot of them, and there's different models that they're being used in the state of different agencies that are using mental health professionals to assist them. And if it's safe, or they think it's safe, they can send out a mental health person instead of a law enforcement individual. But when, like in this case, well, in the Thorndike case, or in this case I was just talking about with the 24-year-old, it would not have been safe to send a mental, even though the individual was in a mental health crisis, it would have not been safe to send a mental health professional there, even with another law enforcement person, because this person was in a mental health crisis wielding a knife, for example, in this case that we just reviewed. And you couldn't put another citizen, you couldn't put another citizen in danger. So they couldn't bring a non-law enforcement agency person there, even though the individual was in a mental health crisis. So those, when there's time to strategize, get information, like Francine says, first we got to have the information available. If it's not, in the case she's talking about in Kennebec County, didn't talk to Augusta, couldn't talk to, the state police. In Augusta, PD had all, most of the information. They weren't able to provide it. And even if they have a mental health individual that they can consult with, it doesn't work in obviously every case, which goes back to Francine's point about at some point the panel in conversation with the committee needs to look beyond the particular incident, because community mental health agencies and these mental health workers who could perhaps intervene with some of these individuals who have time and time again come to law enforcement attention are where there can be some long-term potential changes made.
Thank you. Representative Record, did you have a follow-up, or are you set for now?
I'm set.
Thank you. Representative Moriarty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One observation to begin with is that the elements, we live in a situation, regardless of where we are in the state, in which the elements of a crisis are all around us all the time. The elements may be more or less severe, depending upon the particular facts of the situation and what the living arrangements are and what accommodations have been made. not officially, but sort of internally within the household. And yet, unpredictably, the elements will crystallize into a crisis, and with no notice, and need for as rapid a response as possible. So you have no time to gather a team of seasoned veterans, paraprofessionals, or PhD psychologists or whatever to address the mental health aspects. That's just really not feasible under these kinds of circumstances. I appreciate the point. Another observation is that I appreciate the point about sort of shuffling the deck of the membership of the panel while keeping it at the same time at a workable level. And that has some appeal to me. But I found myself going back to one of Chair Harnett's opening comments about how reports tend to simply end up on a shelf somewhere. So what's really missing for me in this process is certainly not the work of the panel at all, or to any extent, but rather that your work kind of comes to a dead end when you report to judiciary. And we have no power to order a follow-up or further delving into the details. What I could foresee being useful is your report going to the Attorney General's office as well, and perhaps it does anyway, but that the law be changed to require the Attorney General's office to respond to your various recommendations and to get back to us with suggested changes, which might take the role of curriculum changes at the academy, training requirements for officers, or certain protocols for actual involvement when the crisis crystallizes. That's the one sort of hard and fast conclusion that I've kind of come to as I've listened, and that is that we need more there needs to be a follow-up stage after you have investigated and reported. And that stage, I think, belongs with or is found at the Office of the Attorney General.
Thank you, Representative Moriarty. I have a question, but I want to I want to talk about common records management, because that's a theme that is in your report from January. It's in the report from Thorndike, and it's an issue that's bedeviled me for decades. Whenever we look at bias-based police profiling, or had a committee to try to address those issues, we heard over and over again, well, we have these different systems and they can't talk to one another, and everyone throws their hands up in the air. And I think the time for throwing our hands up in the air has ended. It's an insane patchwork of systems where Department A, who is working with Department B on a particular incident, can't share information with one another. So I don't. My only solution to that is to get rid of this. These different systems being in place. So I just want to, support you on that conclusion that you've reached, that if you're only as good as the information that you have in front of you, and if the responding officers have different information and they can't talk to one another about it, it's a recipe for disaster. I want to get back to, the issue about diversity on the panel and also voices that are heard. I wholeheartedly agree with the observations of Vice Chair Vafiatis and Chair Stark about changing the makeup of the committee the panel without necessarily expanding the size of the panel to a great degree so that it's not unwieldy. But what I also heard, I think, from Vice Chair Vafiatis is there are more voices that need to be heard either by the panel or in a forum on this issue. And one of the toughest ones that she raised was family members that were involved in these situations, maybe after a sufficient amount of time has passed that they can actually talk about that. And so my question is, those additional voices that you think need to be heard, is that for just the panel to hear from them, or is it about convening a larger forum on these issues and the specific recommendations raised by the panel?
Well, one of the reasons that I talked a little bit more about that was Senator Carney brought up the issues of hearing from other individuals. And there's two ways, I mean, there are a number of ways to do it. One of the things we have talked a little bit about on the panel is maybe inviting, for example, like a law enforcement officer who's retired, you know, who he was involved in one of these cases and then retired from the force and, you know, isn't involved. We've talked about maybe inviting someone like that, for example, to the panel, to talk to the panel. I know that a number of individuals, private individuals, have contacted Francine and talked about their personal story and the individual, and you know, that they felt like, well, this happened at the end, but this doesn't who they were as a person in life, and it just the kind of like they were, you know, in this last case we just reviewed, there was part of our material was the obituary from the family for this man who died, and there was no mention, of course, of how he died, but there was a story about this individual. That's a different story than what you hear in the paper at the end. And then there's also, and I don't know what would, you know, I always, this comes from a long time of being involved with legislative committees and our current circumstances in public discourse. So I'll put that out as my sort of bias. I think that the committee, it might be useful for the committee to hear a variety of voices. But, you know, I would think you'd want it in some kind of context, like in response perhaps to the annual report of the panel. Like next year you get the annual report, it makes some specific recommendations. I mean, part of it is trying to put some, I'm not trying, you know, thinking of some guardrails you could put around a conversation and how you would want to invite it. And that perhaps you want to invite it of people that have looked at these cases from a variety of perspectives. And maybe you'd want to have a conversation of just a number of invitees. You might want to invite 4 or 5 different voices to come and speak because the panel has issued its annual report. And do they have any thoughts on it? Just, you know, I'm sure, you know, that you have your own creative ways of thinking about it. But I do agree with Senator Carney and Representative Harnett's inquiry about that there are some ways to do it. And I think the other thing is that the panel reports to you. If you ask us to do something, you don't have to put it in legislation. If you ask the panel to be more, to do some things, to think about some things, to invite some people, we'll do it. You give us an outline or some things, and the panel will figure out a way if we can get people to cooperate, voluntarily cooperate. Obviously, we don't have any enforcement power, but if we can get people to voluntarily cooperate, we'd be happy to try to create a forum. I'm not trying to remove you from it, but you know, if there's this information you want to know or things you want to know, the panel is very receptive to having a continuing dialogue with the committee.
Thank you for that. And that leads me to, and I'll get right to you, Senator Carney, sorry. One of the, Ventine, you just said that, you know, if the committee wants you to do something, let us know and we'll do it. But I also heard from Chair Stark saying this is a volunteer panel and we don't have the staff to do what we perhaps need to do. And that one of the areas that reveals itself is, and I believe it was Chair Stark who said, you know, the more specific and evidence-based the recommendations are, the more credibility you're going to have with law enforcement and with the public. And as currently structured, you don't have that that's a lot to ask of a volunteer citizen committee. So I just want to put on the table that, perhaps staffing is something that needs to be considered in future legislatures. Senator Carney?
I agree wholeheartedly with what you said about needing to create a framework where we can make evidence-based policy. And I just wanted to lift that up and say it again because I think it's so important, Representative Barnett. I wanted to just take a little step back in time and ask Vendine if you could comment on the difference between inviting people to speak to the committee in response to the report, which is a public forum that will likely be in a hybrid format and shown and live forever on YouTube, versus the confidential proceedings of the panel, those conversations. And if you could and both of you actually could talk a little bit about, is one format better than the other, or is the better approach to take it in steps and have a confidential conversation with the panel, bringing in members of the public who have unique perspectives on, or have, I guess, direct experience with the use of deadly force? Or how are we going to get the best information given the barrier that the public forum might create?
Well, I think that part of the answer to this question, of course, this is the lawyer in me coming out, is what do we want to find out? There's a variety of reasons of why we invite input. And I never like to invite input, and I know this committee doesn't. I never like to invite input and raise an expectation that I can do something with the information, and I can't. So, if I can. So part of it is trying to expand voices, which we've already agreed that perhaps they could do it by panel membership. And we've already been talking on the panel about getting more voices in the confidential way to come and talk to us. So that is useful. I often find that, especially a member of the public that either is interested or has had a personal experience with this circumstance, they want you to do something. They want us to do something. They want you to do something. They want this to not happen again. They want it to be recognized that this individual, was in crisis and now they're dead. And couldn't there have been something else done? I can't answer that question for them. However, we have had individuals, family members that's reached out to the panel. And I think we could also find individual family members that we could maybe perhaps have a little fuller discussion without their expectation that we would be responsible for bringing this person back or making sure that it never happens again to an individual. From the committee's perspective, there was a reason that the committee created this panel. I don't know. I mean, I read the statutory. I wasn't around. I didn't hear the public policy. I know there's lots of public policy conversation around it. I didn't hear it. I didn't go back and read it. I just look at what's in the statute of what you're asking us to do. If there's some way that the Judiciary Committee wants to invite, and I say that word purposefully, invite a fuller conversation for the purpose, of some of the individuals that are touched by these circumstances, law enforcement, the public community. I think that would be an opportunity for the committee to invite a few people in to talk to them. If it was, we've got this panel's annual report. These are recommendations and observations they've made. Do you have a perspective on them, or is it, you want to comment on them? I think that creates an opportunity for some public input. But that if there is a public forum created around law enforcement shootings, to put it any other way, it could be a very lively conversation not characterize it, but there'd be a lot of people. An open conversation with the Judiciary Committee on that could be pretty extensive and difficult to contain, I think, and to be honest, in terms of the feedback you get and the expectations of what you're supposed to do about it. So I think that would be, I'm being a little obtuse here because I'm trying to be respectful of the various political opinions of individuals in the community. But I think you want to be, put some context around it. And if you'd like us, the panel, to make an effort to talk to some individuals and provide you with some feedback from additional voices, and we can be in a confidential circumstance, I think we're willing to do that. And Representative Harnett, when have you ever asked me to do anything when I didn't say to you, I would be happy to do that if you provide me with this, if I can have that support, and if we have these resources. So I appreciate you being sensitive to the fact that the panel has very limited resources. So thank you for that.
And that has never happened, but I'll keep trying with that. But no, thank you. And I don't, please know I respect the work of the panel. I just want to be realistic about what we can ask a citizen volunteer panel without any staffing to do. And I don't, talk about expectations. I don't want to establish expectations that are not fair to the people we're asking to perform that function.
Thank you very much.
Just add to what Vendine said. I mean, this is not a conversation that our panel has had. So I'm speaking with my other hats on, having served now for a number of years on the Domestic Abuse Homicide Review Panel that reviews the domestic abuse related homicides in the state. One of the important differences is that surviving family members of victims of homicide have available advocates within the Attorney General's office to support them through what sometimes is a very long process until there is prosecution of the person who's committed the crime. And so when that panel convenes to have its conversations about incidents, it has the benefit of those advocates having in fact had conversations with the surviving family that can be brought to bear. Without that family member coming into this room full of professionals with a variety of hats on and who knows what kind of environment that would be perceived to be by some of these folks. But those reflections are brought forward regularly when they're available and those family members want to bring it, which is again a question of capacity and also what is the function of a given staff person. Like if we're looking for a staff person for our panel to provide any kind of regular attempted liaison with former associates, family members, colleagues of people who have been involved in shootings, then that's a particular skill set to be able to do that kind of conversation and provide that kind of liaison experience with people. I think that there is, having had a couple of conversations with family members, what they wanted to tell me about was not about the incident itself, but about their struggles prior to that incident to get the kind of intervention that this person needed or the kind of supports that this person needed. What is so difficult, I think, for us to recognize as a community is how much is frequently known or suspected by neighbors, friends, and family members, and the difficulty of trying to figure out how to get something to happen to prevent almost predictable outcomes given what the people closest are concerned about. So I think convening even a focus group might be a thing to do with a limited number of people involved. But I think that a broad public forum would not be a kindness to those people. That is my experience. I think it should be done in a close and respectful way, but you can certainly write meaningful reports based on those kinds of convenings. And we could even look to like the Muskie School Research Center to do some convenings of surviving family members that wouldn't be an ask of our panel, but in fact a not particularly huge contract with our friends at the Cutler Institute, potentially, if that is an interest as a complementary set of information and facts. I personally really want the Committee on Health and Human Services to look at all of our reports. I wish that every time we sent a report to all of you, it would be shared with both HHS and criminal justice and public safety, and that there would be occasionally conversations where there were cross-convening of even the chairs of those three committees to talk about individual reports as well as our annual report, because the observations that we make cut across so many things. And I feel like we are treating this as a criminal justice issue when that is a piece of what is happening here, but it is not exclusively. And so I think that to the degree that it's possible for you all to broaden the conversation across legislative committees and leadership, that would be very helpful, even with what we currently have available to discuss.
Thank you for that. And I was struck by when you were talking about convening, either being at Muskie or in small focus groups, because people want to share the story about who the person who lost their life was, gets us beyond just looking at the incident, which is where we started this discussion, that all of the focus is looking at the final chapter and not the chapters that brought us to that point. So thank you for reaffirming that. Are there additional comments or questions from committee members? Are there any additional comments, Vice Chair Vafiatis or Chair Stark, that you would like to make?
Well, I just would really thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with us. It's really, it's important work, what you do and all the issues that you have to deal with, and it's important work of the panel. And I just want you to know that despite our comments about expanding the panel, that the existing membership of the panel and the existing members on the panel, they don't miss a meeting. They come prepared. They review that material. They take this work so seriously, wherever they sit. And every individual on that panel, even though they sit often with a particular title, they look way beyond that in their willingness to share information and be open in information. We couldn't come up with these, I think, quite useful observations and recommendations without the full participation. It's a lot of work, and every existing panel member takes it very seriously and brings a wealth of personal as well as professional commitment to it. And we're very, very fortunate that we have such quality folks that exist on the panel. And I want to thank you for this dialogue, for taking so much time to talk with us. It's important work, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Thank you. And I wish that after the last 90 minutes or so that I could wrap it up with, we're going to do A, B, C, and D and put a nice bow on it. But that's not possible. This has been very helpful to me, and speaking for all of the members of the committee, both present and who were unable to be here, some of whom are watching on YouTube. I want to thank you both very much for taking the time to talk with us today, to share your concerns, your thoughts, and to listen to our concerns and thoughts, and recognize that after we review what we've heard today, I suspect that this conversation will continue before the start of the next session. So with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Peggy and Janet. Thank you, committee members. And unless there are committee members who have something else to add, I would again send our thanks and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Take
Yeah.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.